In the spring of 1952, a small Soviet delegation arrived quietly at an international scientific conference in Western Europe, carrying no classified documents, no false passports, and no obvious intelligence officers, only physicists, engineers, and administrators whose credentials were legitimate and whose presence raised no alarms, because nothing about their arrival violated the rules of the institution hosting them. And this normality was precisely the point, as Soviet intelligence by this stage had already concluded that international scientific organizations offered something traditional espionage could not provide, which was sustained, renewable access to Western research environments under conditions where openness was expected and suspicion was politically costly. The Soviet services did not approach these organizations as places to steal secrets in the conventional sense, but as environments to be inhabited over years, sometimes decades, where information flowed through conversations, draft papers, committee meetings, and informal professional relationships that were impossible to monitor comprehensively without undermining the institutions themselves. This strategy emerged from a sober assessment made in the late 1940s, when Soviet planners recognized that post-war scientific progress in the West was becoming increasingly collaborative, international, and institutionally organized, meaning that the most important technological advances were no longer confined to single laboratories or classified facilities, but were instead shaped by networks of researchers, funding bodies, and standard-setting organizations whose decisions determined what problems were worked on, which methods were favored, and which lines of inquiry received sustained support. By embedding personnel inside these structures, Soviet intelligence could observe not only what Western scientists had already achieved, but what they were about to attempt, which fields were accelerating, which were stagnating, and where future military or industrial relevance was likely to emerge. Academic cover was central to this effort because it allowed repeated access without escalation. As scientists could attend conferences annually, sit on committees, review papers, and correspond freely without triggering the counterintelligence mechanisms that would activate around diplomats, journalists, or commercial representatives. Candidates selected for this role were chosen carefully, not only for their technical competence, but for their ability to operate credibly in Western academic culture, including language fluency, professional demeanor, and the discipline to remain within institutional norms at all times, because the greatest threat to long-term access was not detection of espionage, but exclusion from the scientific community itself. Once embedded, these individuals were not instructed to collect specific documents or recruit sources in the traditional sense, but to observe processes, track discussions, and report on the internal dynamics of the organizations they joined, including how research agendas were set, how funding priorities shifted, which individuals carried informal influence, and how emerging fields were evaluated before they reached maturity. Information gathered in this way was often mundane in isolation, consisting of meeting summaries, draft reports, or impressions of professional debate. But when aggregated over time and across multiple organizations, it provided Soviet analysts with a detailed picture of Western scientific direction that could not be obtained through isolated acts of theft. Institutional access was therefore treated as the core objective, and Soviet representatives were encouraged to seek positions that offered procedural visibility rather than prestige, such as working groups, editorial boards, and administrative committees, where decisions were shaped quietly long before they became public outcomes. This approach required restraint because aggressive behavior, ideological advocacy, or overt influence attempts risked provoking resistance that could collapse access entirely, and internal guidance emphasized that the primary mission was continuity rather than immediate gain. Technology acquisition under this model was indirect and anticipatory, as exposure to preliminary findings, methodological debates, and experimental approaches allowed Soviet research planners to understand how problems were being framed and solved in the West, even when finished results remained unpublished or proprietary. And this understanding fed into domestic planning processes where similar lines of research could be adapted, accelerated, or deprioritized based on observed trends. Coordination inside the Soviet system ensured that information from international scientific engagement was routed efficiently to relevant ministries, research institutes, and industrial planners, blurring the boundary between scientific, diplomacy, and intelligence work without requiring overt operational control. Western awareness of Soviet interest in scientific organizations existed from the beginning, but responses were constrained by the nature of the institutions themselves, as international scientific bodies were built on principles of openness, exchange, and political neutrality, and excluding Soviet participation risked undermining their legitimacy and fracturing cooperation among Western allies who did not share uniform security priorities. This structural constraint limited the effectiveness of counterintelligence measures, allowing Soviet participation to persist, even as suspicion increased, particularly because no single act of collection violated institutional rules. By the mid-1950s, this method had proven sufficiently effective that Soviet intelligence treated international scientific organizations as a permanent domain of competition rather than a temporary opportunity, allocating resources accordingly and refining selection, training, and reporting procedures to support long-term engagement. What distinguished this strategy from other intelligence efforts was its patience, as success was measured not in spectacular acquisitions or exposed operations, but in uninterrupted access and the gradual accumulation of insight into how scientific power was organized and exercised in the West. This first phase established the foundational logic that would govern Soviet intelligence penetration of scientific institutions for the next 3 decades, grounded in the belief that in an era where knowledge moved through institutions rather than individuals, the most valuable position was not outside the system attempting to penetrate it, but inside it, behaving normally, observing quietly, and remaining indispensable enough to never be asked to leave. By the early 1960s, the Soviet intelligence presence inside international scientific organizations had become routine rather than exceptional, and this normality was carefully cultivated because the objective was no longer simply to gain entry, but to remain embedded as the scale and importance of multinational scientific cooperation expanded under Cold War competition. Soviet planners understood that the value of these institutions increased as science itself became more expensive, collaborative, and bureaucratically organized, meaning that decisions made in committee rooms and working groups increasingly shaped entire fields of research years before results appeared in journals or products, and access to those decision points therefore offered strategic visibility that no single laboratory breach could match. During this period, Soviet representatives were deliberately steered toward roles that combined technical legitimacy with procedural reach, such as standards committees, review panels, and coordination offices, where they could observe how Western governments, universities, and corporations translated political priorities into funded research programs, and how scientific consensus was constructed through negotiation rather than discovery alone. Intelligence reporting from these environments focused heavily on process, documenting which disciplines attracted sustained investment, which technologies encountered skepticism or resistance, and how concerns about military relevance influenced ostensibly civilian research agendas, providing early warning of areas likely to generate strategic advantage. Academic cover continued to shield this activity, as conference attendance, peer review, and professional correspondence were treated as routine elements of scientific life, allowing Soviet participants to maintain frequent contact without triggering scrutiny. And this predictability reduced the likelihood that Western counterintelligence services could justify intrusive monitoring without undermining the institution's credibility. Internal guidance emphasized behavioral discipline above all else, instructing participants to avoid ideological argument, refrain from overt influence, and adhere strictly to professional norms, because even subtle deviation risked reputational damage that could close doors permanently. The emphasis on reputation reflected a clear understanding that within scientific communities, trust accumulated slowly but could be lost quickly, and once lost, it could not be restored through official channels. Technology acquisition during this phase remained indirect, with Soviet intelligence prioritizing exposure to research methods, instrumentation trends, and experimental design over access to finished data, because these elements revealed how Western scientists approached problems and where future breakthroughs were most likely to occur. This information was particularly valuable in fields where outcomes depended on technique and iteration rather than on singular discoveries, allowing Soviet planners to adjust domestic research strategies without copying specific results. Coordination between intelligence services and Soviet scientific administration ensured that insights gathered abroad were integrated into national planning, often influencing resource allocation, institute focus, and training priorities, reinforcing the strategic value of participation even when tangible outputs were modest. Western awareness of Soviet activity increased gradually, especially as concerns about technology transfer grew, but responses remained fragmented as multinational organizations lacked unified security authority and member states differed in their tolerance for risk, creating an environment where suspicion rarely translated into exclusion. This ambiguity worked in favor of Soviet intelligence, as the absence of clear violations allowed participation to continue under the protection of institutional norms. By the mid-1960s, penetration of international scientific organizations had become a stable, self-sustaining system, requiring less direct oversight as routine solidified and participants learned to navigate environments intuitively, and this stability reinforced the long-term nature of the strategy. What mattered was not the volume of information collected in any given year, but the continuity of access across decades, allowing Soviet intelligence to track scientific evolution as it happened rather than reconstruct it after the fact. This phase demonstrated that the true advantage of institutional penetration lay in temporal depth, as sustained observation provided context that isolated intelligence coups could never supply, embedding Soviet intelligence inside the machinery of Western scientific progress without ever needing to disrupt it. By the 1970s, international scientific organizations had grown into dense bureaucratic systems linking universities, government agencies, and industrial laboratories across national boundaries, and Soviet intelligence adjusted its approach accordingly, because the value of access now lay less in individual personalities and more in understanding how large, multi-layered research ecosystems functioned under political constraint. Soviet representatives inside these bodies were instructed to pay close attention to how funding priorities were negotiated, how security restrictions were introduced without public confrontation, and how sensitive research was partitioned into open and restricted components, because these mechanisms revealed where Western governments perceived strategic risk, and how they attempted to manage it without dismantling international cooperation. Participation in administrative and coordinating roles became increasingly important during this period, as such positions offered visibility into correspondence, scheduling, draft agendas, and internal disputes that rarely appeared in published material but shaped outcomes months or years in advance. Intelligence reporting from these roles often described procedural shifts rather than scientific results, noting changes in review criteria, delays in publication, or the quiet reclassification of research areas, all of which signaled evolving military or industrial relevance. Technology acquisition remained indirect and cumulative, as exposure to evolving methodologies, instrumentation standards, and collaborative practices allowed Soviet analysts to assess not only what the West was developing, but how efficiently it could translate research into application, an assessment critical to long-term strategic planning. Academic cover continued to function as a protective layer, enabling repeated travel and sustained correspondence even as political tensions fluctuated, and this continuity insulated intelligence collection from short-term diplomatic crises that might otherwise disrupt access. Western counterintelligence awareness became more explicit during the decade, particularly as export control regimes expanded. But the multilateral nature of scientific organizations limited enforcement because restrictions imposed by one state could be offset by more permissive policies elsewhere, and exclusion required consensus that was rarely achievable. Soviet intelligence exploited this fragmentation by maintaining strict compliance with formal rules while maximizing legitimate exposure, reinforcing a posture of legality that made decisive countermeasures difficult to justify. Coordination within the Soviet system ensured that insights from scientific engagement were aggregated across multiple organizations, allowing analysts to identify converging trends rather than isolated developments. And this synthesis informed decisions about domestic research investment, education priorities, and industrial planning. The emphasis on aggregation underscored the strategic logic of the entire effort, as value derived from pattern recognition over time rather than from immediate replication of specific technologies. Restraint remained central, as participants were reminded that the loss of access would outweigh any short-term gain from aggressive collection, and this discipline allowed penetration to persist even as scrutiny increased. By the end of the 1970s, Soviet intelligence penetration of international scientific organizations had become one of the most reliable channels for observing Western technological direction, precisely because it operated within accepted institutional boundaries and adapted to growing complexity without provoking rupture. This phase demonstrated that intelligence competition in the scientific domain was governed less by confrontation than by endurance, with success measured in uninterrupted presence and accumulated understanding rather than dramatic acquisition. As the early 1980s began, the environment surrounding international scientific organizations tightened, but the Soviet intelligence presence did not collapse because it had been designed from the outset to survive precisely this kind of pressure by operating within rules rather than around them. Western governments increasingly treated advanced research as a strategic asset, introducing export controls, funding restrictions, and quiet security guidance aimed at limiting technology leakage. Yet, these measures were layered onto institutions whose legitimacy depended on openness and multinational participation, creating a controlled but permeable environment rather than a sealed one. Soviet representatives adapted by narrowing their focus to roles and forums that remained formally open, such as technical subcommittees, advisory panels, and coordination groups, where discussion of methods, priorities, and future directions continued, even as access to sensitive end products was curtailed. Intelligence reporting from this period shows a shift toward meta-level observation, documenting how Western institutions managed the tension between security and cooperation. which research areas were increasingly insulated and which remained exposed through necessity or inertia, providing insight into where strategic concern was intensifying. Academic cover became even more important as scrutiny increased, because long-standing professional credibility offered protection that newer participants lacked, and Soviet intelligence therefore prioritized continuity of personnel, valuing reputation and familiarity over rapid turnover that could draw attention. This continuity allowed embedded individuals to retain access even as political rhetoric hardened, reinforcing the advantage of long-term presence. Technology acquisition during this phase was explicitly anticipatory rather than extractive, as Soviet analysts focused on understanding trajectories rather than obtaining designs. Recognizing that insight into where Western science was heading could inform domestic planning even when replication was constrained by industrial limitations. Coordination within the Soviet system ensured that this intelligence was not treated as isolated reporting, but integrated into broader assessments of Western technological capacity, vulnerability, and resilience, shaping strategic expectations rather than immediate programs. Western counterintelligence responses increasingly emphasized segmentation of projects and compartmentalization of sensitive work rather than exclusion from international bodies, a choice that implicitly acknowledged the difficulty of policing multinational institutions without undermining them. And this choice preserved the structural space in which Soviet intelligence operated. Restraint remained the defining operational principle, as aggressive behavior risked not only individual expulsion, but damage to the credibility of Soviet participation across multiple organizations, a cost that planners consistently judged unacceptable. By the mid-1980s, penetration of international scientific organizations had become less about maximizing access and more about preserving it, ensuring that channels of observation remained open even as their content narrowed. This preservation strategy reflected a mature understanding of diminishing returns and rising risk. Yet it did not negate the strategic value of continued engagement, because sustained visibility into institutional behavior still offered insight into how scientific power was organized and protected. The endurance of Soviet presence under these conditions demonstrated the robustness of an intelligence strategy built on legitimacy, patience, and institutional embedding, showing that even as the Cold War intensified, competition in the scientific domain remained governed by norms that limited outright exclusion. This phase confirmed that the principal achievement of penetration lay not in exploiting openness at its peak, but in maintaining access as openness receded, ensuring that Soviet intelligence retained a continuous vantage point from which to observe the evolution of Western science under security pressure. By the late 1980s, Soviet intelligence penetration of international scientific organizations had reached a point of diminishing but still significant returns, as decades of accumulated access had produced a deep institutional memory of how Western science evolved under pressure, even as the practical ability to translate insight into competitive advantage narrowed. Internal assessments from this period recognize that observation alone could not overcome structural weaknesses in industrial capacity or innovation speed. Yet they also concluded that abandoning access would leave Soviet planners blind to the processes shaping future technological power, a risk judged greater than the cost of continued engagement. Soviet representatives therefore remained embedded in committees, working groups, and coordinating bodies, focusing less on individual research outcomes and more on tracking how restrictions were implemented, how collaboration adapted, and which fields continued to receive protected investment despite political tension. This focus provided context for interpreting Western policy shifts, allowing intelligence analysts to distinguish between symbolic security measures and substantive reorientation of research priorities. Academic cover continued to shield participation, as long-standing reputations and professional relationships insulated individuals from sudden exclusion, and this insulation reinforced the value of continuity over expansion, ensuring that presence was maintained even as access narrowed. Western counterintelligence efforts increasingly accepted this reality, concentrating on damage limitation through compartmentalization rather than attempting wholesale exclusion that would fracture multinational cooperation, an approach that implicitly preserved the institutional space Soviet intelligence occupied. Coordination within the Soviet system ensured that insights gathered during this phase were synthesized with broader economic and technological assessments, contributing to a realistic understanding of the gap between awareness and capability and shaping expectations about future competition rather than immediate replication. The endurance of this strategy into the final years of the Cold War underscored its fundamental logic, as legitimacy and patience proved more resilient than aggressive collection in environments governed by professional norms and international consensus. Even as political transformation loomed, the mechanisms of scientific cooperation remained intact, and Soviet intelligence continued to operate within them because the value of understanding global scientific organization transcended ideological confrontation. By the time the Cold War ended, the penetration of international scientific organizations stood as one of the most stable intelligence activities of the Soviet period, not because it delivered decisive technological breakthroughs, but because it provided sustained situational awareness of how knowledge, funding, and collaboration were structured in the modern world. This continuity allowed Soviet analysts to observe not only scientific trends, but the institutional responses to security pressure, offering lessons about the relationship between openness and control that extended beyond the immediate rivalry. In retrospect, the significance of this penetration lies in its demonstration that intelligence competition in scientific domains rewards endurance over drama, and that in a system where innovation is collective and institutional, the most valuable position is not the one that seizes a secret, but the one that remains quietly present as decisions are made, priorities shift, and the future takes shape. In the final assessment of Soviet intelligence penetration of international scientific organizations, the record shows a strategy defined less by dramatic acquisition than by disciplined endurance, because over nearly 4 decades, the Soviet services succeeded in maintaining continuous access to the institutional machinery through which Western scientific power was organized, debated, and directed, even as political conditions hardened and security measures intensified. This access was achieved not through covert breaches or ideological confrontation, but through careful adherence to professional norms, credible academic participation, and a deliberate focus on process rather than product, allowing Soviet representatives to observe how research priorities were set, how funding was allocated, and how emerging fields were quietly elevated or constrained long before outcomes became visible. The use of academic cover proved decisive, as it enabled repeated engagement without escalation, insulated participants through reputation and familiarity, and allowed intelligence objectives to be pursued through conversation, committee work, and routine correspondence, rather than through actions that would trigger exclusion. Institutional access, particularly in administrative and coordinating roles, provided visibility into internal dynamics that could not be captured through published research alone, offering insight into the relationship between science, policy, and security in Western systems. Technology acquisition under this model remained indirect and cumulative, supplying Soviet planners with understanding of methods, trajectories, and organizational efficiency rather than with finished designs. And while this insight could not compensate for industrial or economic limitations, it reduced uncertainty and informed long-term strategic assessment. Western counterintelligence responses, constrained by the multinational and open character of scientific organizations, focused on compartmentalization rather than exclusion, a choice that preserved institutional legitimacy but also sustained the space in which Soviet intelligence operated. By the end of the Cold War, this penetration had yielded a detailed, if incomplete, map of Western scientific ecosystems, illustrating how innovation was governed, protected, and adapted under pressure. The significance of this activity lies not in isolated successes, but in its continuity, demonstrating that in a world where scientific progress depends on institutions rather than individuals, intelligence advantage accrues to those who remain present, as decisions are made rather than those who strike and disappear. Soviet intelligence penetration of international scientific organizations thus stands as a case study in how legitimacy, patience, and institutional embedding can sustain access across decades of rivalry, revealing that in the contest for technological awareness, the quiet observer inside the system often sees more than the intruder trying to break in.